In the summer of 1887, when the West was still wild and unforgiving, a desperate cowboy clutched a screaming infant on the dusty road to Denver. The baby hadn't stopped crying for 3 days. Fellow passengers shot him angry glares while the driver threatened to leave them both at the next water stop. But, hidden beneath a black mourning veil sat a woman carrying her own secrets that would change both their lives forever. This is the true story of how two strangers, bound by grief and circumstance, discovered that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships can save us when we're drowning in our darkest moments. The stagecoach lurched violently as it hit another pothole, and the baby's wails reached a pitch that made every passenger wince. Jake Morrison pressed the tiny bundle closer to his chest, sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning chill. The infant had been crying for what felt like forever, and Jake's arms ached from holding her awkward against his broad frame. "That child needs to quiet down before I lose my mind," growled a heavy-set merchant sitting across from him. The man's face had turned an unhealthy shade of red, and his fingers drummed impatiently on his leather satchel. Jake shot him a warning look but said nothing. What could he say? That he'd never held a baby before 3 days ago? That he had no idea what he was doing? That the child's mother had died giving birth in a one-room cabin while he stood helpless, watching the only woman he'd ever loved slip away? The baby's cries intensified, and Jake felt panic rising in his throat. He'd tried everything he could think of. He'd fed her the goat's milk he'd managed to buy at the last stop, though most of it had ended up on his shirt. He'd changed the cloth diaper, fumbling with the unfamiliar task until his hands were raw. He'd walked her around the cramped confines of the coach until his legs gave out. Nothing worked. "Maybe try singing to her," suggested an elderly man with kind eyes who sat in the corner. "Babies like music, I hear." Jake's face burned with embarrassment. His voice was meant for calling cattle, not soothing infants. But desperation made him try anyway. He hummed a low tune his mother had sung to him years ago, before consumption took her when he was barely 12. The baby's cries didn't stop, but they seemed to soften slightly. The woman in black hadn't said a word since boarding in Colorado Springs. She sat perfectly still, her mourning veil obscuring her face, hands folded primly in her lap. Jake had noticed her immediately, not just because of her obvious grief, but because she was the only passenger who hadn't complained about the baby's crying. She'd simply settled into her seat and remained silent, like a shadow dressed in silk. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to do something about that child," the driver called back through the window. "The horses are getting spooked, and my other passengers are threatening to get off at the next stop." Jake's jaw clenched. He understood their frustration, but what were his options? Leave his daughter at some remote way station? He'd made a promise to Sarah as she lay dying, her hand gripping his with surprising strength. "Take care of our baby girl, Jake. Promise me. Don't let her grow up in some orphanage like I did." He'd promised, though he had no idea how to keep that promise. He was a cowboy, not a father. He knew how to break horses and mend fences, how to read weather patterns and survive on hardtack and jerky for weeks at a time. But a baby? A tiny human being who depended on him for everything? The responsibility felt heavier than any load he'd ever carried. The stagecoach pulled into a small trading post for a water break, and most of the passengers climbed out to stretch their legs. The merchant made a point of standing as far from the coach as possible, shaking his head and muttering under his breath. Jake remained in his seat, gently rocking the baby and trying to ignore the curious stares from other travelers. "She's beautiful." Jake looked up, startled. The woman in black had lifted her veil slightly, revealing a pale face marked by recent grief but softened by genuine warmth. Her eyes were the color of storm clouds, and there was something in them that made Jake's chest tighten. "Thank you, ma'am," he managed. "She's got her mother's eyes. And her father's stubborn streak, I'd imagine." The woman's lips curved in the faintest hint of a smile. "May I?" She gestured toward the baby, and Jake hesitated. He'd been so protective, so afraid that someone might try to take his daughter away. But something in this woman's manner, the gentle way she looked at the child, made him trust her instinctively. He carefully transferred the baby to her arms, and something remarkable happened. The crying didn't stop immediately, but it changed. The desperate, panicked wails became softer, almost conversational. The woman adjusted her hold with practiced ease, supporting the baby's head and positioning her against her shoulder in a way that looked completely natural. "What's her name?" the woman asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Rose," Jake replied. "After my mother." Sarah wanted something pretty, something that would remind her of better times. "Rose Morrison." The woman tested the name, nodding approvingly. "It suits her." "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I don't know your name." "Margaret." "Margaret Sinclair." She paused, her expression growing distant. "Mrs. Margaret Sinclair, though I suppose that distinction matters less now." Jake didn't pry, though he could read the story in her black dress and the careful way she spoke about herself. Recent widow, he guessed, probably traveling to start over somewhere new. The West was full of people running from their past, looking for second chances. "Mrs. Sinclair, I have to ask, you seem to know your way around babies. Do you have children of your own?" Margaret's face tightened almost imperceptibly, and Jake immediately regretted the question. But she answered anyway, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "I had a son. Thomas. He would have been 6 months old next week." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with loss. Jake felt his own grief rise to meet hers, understanding passing between them without need for explanation. They were both carrying the weight of death, both trying to figure out how to keep living when the people they loved most were gone. "I'm sorry," Jake said simply. Margaret nodded, her attention returning to baby Rose, who had finally quieted to small hiccups and sighs. "She's hungry," Margaret observed. "But, more than that, she's frightened." Babies know when their world has changed, when the people caring for them are uncertain. "I don't know what I'm doing," Jake admitted, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "Sarah made it look so easy when Rose was born, but I feel like I'm failing her every minute of every day." "You're not failing her." Margaret's voice was firm, almost stern. "You're learning. There's a difference." The driver called for passengers to reboard, and Margaret reluctantly handed Rose back to Jake. But, as she settled the baby in his arms, she adjusted his hold, showing him how to support her head better, how to position her so she felt more secure. "Thank you," Jake said, meaning it more than she could know. As the stagecoach resumed its journey toward Denver, Rose remained peaceful, her tiny fingers wrapped around Jake's thumb. The other passengers seemed relieved by the relative quiet, and even the merchant had stopped glaring in their direction. But Jake found himself stealing glances at Margaret Sinclair, wondering about her story, grateful for her kindness. He'd been alone in his struggle for days, carrying the weight of responsibility and grief without anyone to share the burden. For the first time since Sarah's death, he didn't feel completely lost. Margaret had returned to her silent observation of the landscape, but Jake noticed she occasionally looked their way, a soft expression crossing her features when she watched Rose sleep. There was something there, some connection that had formed in those few moments of shared understanding. As the sun climbed higher and the stagecoach rolled through the endless expanse of prairie grass and distant mountains, Jake began to hope that maybe, somehow, he and Rose wouldn't have to face the uncertain future alone. Maybe there were still kind people in the world, people willing to help a cowboy who was in way over his head with a tiny daughter who deserved better than he knew how to give her. The road to Denver stretched ahead, full of unknowns and possibilities, while baby Rose slept peacefully in her father's arms for the first time in days. The next morning brought new challenges as the stagecoach made its way through increasingly rough terrain. Rose had slept peacefully through the night, curled against Jake's chest while he dozed fitfully against the hard wooden seat. But, with dawn came hunger, and her cries filled the coach once again. Jake fumbled with the bottle of goat's milk, trying to warm it with his body heat as Margaret had quietly suggested the evening before. The older woman had become his silent ally, offering gentle guidance without making him feel foolish or incompetent. When he struggled with the feeding, she would catch his eye and subtly demonstrate the proper angle for the bottle or show him how to burp the baby afterward. "You're getting better at this," Margaret observed as Jake successfully coaxed Rose to take the milk without spilling it all over himself. "Only because you've been helping," Jake replied. "I don't know how I would have managed without you." Margaret looked away, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "I'm not doing anything special." But Jake could see that she was. Every interaction with Rose seemed to bring color back to Margaret's pale cheeks, as if caring for the baby was healing something broken inside her. And, in return, her quiet presence was giving him the confidence he'd been lacking. The merchant, who had introduced himself as Henry Caldwell, had warmed considerably to the situation now that the baby wasn't constantly screaming. "You know," he said to Jake, "my wife always said that babies can sense when adults are nervous. Maybe that's why your little one was so fussy before. You were both learning to trust each other." Jake considered this as he gently rocked Rose. "Maybe you're right. I've been so worried about doing everything wrong that I probably was making her nervous." "Babies are tougher than they look," added the elderly gentleman, who had told them his name was Professor Williams. "I raised 7 of my own, and every one of them survived my fumbling attempts at fatherhood. Children are remarkably forgiving of our mistakes." As the day progressed, an easy camaraderie developed among the passengers. Even the initially gruff driver, a man named Tom Bradley, began checking on Rose's welfare during their stops. "She's got good lungs on her," he said approvingly. "That's the sign of a strong constitution." But it was Margaret's growing attachment to Rose that Jake found most remarkable. The reserved, grieving woman who had barely spoken when she first boarded was slowly coming alive as she helped care for the baby. She would sing softly when Rose was fussy, her voice sweet and melodic. She knew exactly how to swaddle the infant for maximum comfort, and she had an uncanny ability to predict when Rose needed to be fed or changed. During a longer stop at a way station, Margaret walked with Rose while Jake handled some personal business. When he returned, he found her sitting on a bench under a cottonwood tree, the baby content in her arms while she spoke to her in gentle tones. "She's so alert," Margaret was saying to Rose. "Look how you watch everything around you. Your papa says you have your mama's eyes, and I can see why. They're so intelligent, so full of curiosity about this big world you found yourself in." Jake approached quietly, not wanting to interrupt the peaceful scene. Margaret looked up as he drew near, and he was struck by the transformation in her face. The rigid lines of grief had softened, and there was a warmth in her expression that made her look years younger. "She's wonderful, Jake," Margaret said simply. "Sarah must have been very special to have created something so perfect." "She was," Jake agreed, settling beside them on the bench. "She had this way of seeing the good in everything, even when life was hard. I think Rose has inherited that from her." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching Rose grab at Margaret's fingers with her tiny hands. Finally, Margaret spoke again, her voice carefully controlled. "I lost Thomas when he was 3 months old. Fever took him so quickly that I barely had time to understand what was happening. One day he was smiling and cooing, and 3 days later he was gone." Jake felt his heart clench with sympathy. "That's every parent's worst nightmare. I'm sorry you had to go through that." "My husband blamed me," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger. "He said I should have called the doctor sooner, should have done something different. The grief and guilt were consuming both of us, but, instead of supporting each other, we just grew further apart. When pneumonia took him this winter, I realized I had been mourning my marriage for almost as long as I had been mourning my son." "Is that why you're traveling to Denver?" Margaret nodded. "I have a sister there. She's been writing to me for months, asking me to come live with her family. I finally decided to take her up on the offer. There's nothing left for me in Kansas except memories." Rose made a small noise and opened her eyes, looking up at Margaret with what seemed like recognition. Margaret's breath caught, and Jake saw tears gathering in her eyes. "She trusts you," Jake observed. "Babies know good people, I think." "Sometimes I wonder if Thomas sent her to me," Margaret whispered. "I know that sounds foolish, but being able to help care for Rose has been the first time since he died that I felt useful, felt like maybe I have something worthwhile to offer the world." Jake studied Margaret's face, seeing the genuine love and tenderness she showed his daughter. An idea began forming in his mind, one that seemed crazy but also somehow right. "Margaret," he said carefully, "what are your plans when we reach Denver?" I mean, do you have employment arranged, or will you be depending on your sister's charity? I suppose I'll be looking for work. I can teach school or keep house for a family. I have some savings, but not enough to live independently for very long. Jake took a deep breath. I have a proposition for you, if you're willing to hear me out. Margaret looked at him curiously, shifting Rose to a more comfortable position. I have a small ranch about 30 miles north of Denver, Jake continued. It's not much, a cabin, a barn, enough grazing land for a modest herd of cattle. Sarah and I were planning to build it up together, create a real home there. But I can't manage the ranch and care for Rose properly at the same time. She needs someone who knows about babies, someone who can give her the kind of attention and love she deserves. What are you asking? I'm asking if you'd consider coming to work for me as Rose's nanny. I can offer you your own room, meals, and a fair wage. It would be a chance for you to be around children again, and it would give Rose the feminine influence she's going to need as she grows up. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently stroking Rose's soft hair. Jake held his breath, realizing how much he wanted her to say yes. It wasn't just that he needed help with Rose, though he desperately did. There was something about Margaret that felt right, like she was meant to be part of their small family. You barely know me, Margaret said finally. How can you be sure I'm trustworthy with your daughter? Because I've watched you with her, Jake replied. I've seen how gentle you are, how naturally you care for her. And I've seen how much happiness she brings you. Rose needs someone who will love her, not just tend to her basic needs. I think you could love her. Margaret looked down at Rose, who was now sleeping peacefully in her arms. I already do, she admitted quietly. The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and precious. Jake felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. Then, you'll consider it? I'll consider it, Margaret agreed. But I want to be clear about something. If I take this position, it's because I believe it's what's best for Rose, not because I'm looking for charity or an easy situation. I've lost too much to settle for anything less than complete honesty. I wouldn't want it any other way, Jake said. Rose deserves nothing but the best, and I think you might be exactly what she needs. As they prepared to reboard the stagecoach, Jake felt a sense of hope he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. Maybe this was how families were supposed to form, not just through blood and marriage, but through shared need and mutual care. Maybe Rose would grow up with the loving mother figure she deserved, and maybe Margaret would find the purpose and healing she was seeking. The road to Denver was bringing them all toward an uncertain future, but, for the first time in weeks, Jake believed it might be a future worth embracing. 6 months later, the Morrison Ranch had transformed from a lonely outpost into something that felt like a real home. Margaret had proven to be everything Jake had hoped and more. She had a natural gift with Rose, who now babbled happily and reached eagerly for Margaret whenever she entered a room. The baby was thriving under Margaret's careful attention, growing plump and healthy with rosy cheeks and bright, curious eyes. But it wasn't just Rose who was flourishing. Margaret herself had blossomed in ways that surprised even Jake. The pale, grief-stricken woman who had boarded the stagecoach in mourning clothes had been replaced by someone vibrant and purposeful. She had taken charge of not just Rose's care, but the entire household, turning the rough bachelor quarters into a warm, welcoming home. The cabin now boasted curtains in the windows, wildflowers on the table, and the constant smell of fresh bread and simmering stew. Margaret had planted a garden that produced vegetables Jake had never thought to grow himself, and she had somehow convinced the chickens to lay eggs more regularly than they ever had before. You've worked a miracle here, Jake told her one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. Rose was on Margaret's lap, contentedly chewing on a wooden rattle Jake had carved for her. It's not a miracle, Margaret replied with a smile. It's just what happens when a place gets proper attention and care. Jake had come to understand that Margaret was talking about more than just the cabin and garden. He'd watched her slowly come back to life over the months, finding joy again in small daily rituals and the satisfying work of creating a home. She still wore her wedding ring, and sometimes he caught her looking distant and sad, but those moments came less frequently as time passed. Their arrangement had evolved naturally into something deeper than employer and employee. They shared meals and evening conversations, worked together on ranch projects, and collaborated on Rose's care with the easy partnership of people who had learned to trust each other completely. Jake found himself looking forward to coming in from the range each day, knowing he would find Margaret and Rose waiting for him with stories of their day and a warm meal ready to share. But, lately, Jake had been grappling with feelings that went beyond gratitude and friendship. He had begun to notice how Margaret's eyes sparkled when she laughed, how gracefully she moved around the kitchen, how her voice grew soft and tender when she sang Rose to sleep each night. He found excuses to stand close to her when they were working together, and he felt a stirring of something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. The realization troubled him. He had loved Sarah with everything he had, and part of him felt guilty for being able to care about another woman so soon after losing her. But Margaret wasn't a replacement for Sarah, she was something entirely different, bringing her own unique strengths and perspectives to their little family. The question that kept him awake at night was whether Margaret might be developing similar feelings. She seemed content with their current arrangement, but Jake sometimes caught her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. There was warmth there, certainly, and affection, but whether it went any deeper, he couldn't tell. One afternoon in late autumn, while Rose napped peacefully in her cradle, Margaret was in the garden harvesting the last of the winter vegetables when a rider approached the ranch. Jake recognized him immediately. It was Tom Bradley, the stagecoach driver who had brought them all together. "Jake Morrison," Tom called out as he dismounted. "Good to see you again. I was in the area and thought I'd stop by to see how you and that baby of yours are getting along." "Tom, it's great to see you," Jake replied, shaking the older man's hand warmly. "Come up to the house. Margaret will want to see you too." Margaret emerged from the garden with a basket of vegetables, her face lighting up when she saw their visitor. "Mr. Bradley. What a wonderful surprise." "Mrs. Sinclair, you look well," Tom said, tipping his hat. "Ranch life seems to agree with you." "It does indeed," Margaret replied. "Come inside. I'll make coffee, and you can meet Rose properly. She's grown so much since that stagecoach ride." As they gathered around the kitchen table, with Rose gurgling happily in Margaret's arms, Tom regaled them with stories from his travels. He had news of their fellow passengers. Professor Williams had reached his destination safely and sent his regards, and Henry Caldwell had written to Tom to ask about the baby who had disrupted his journey but ultimately won his heart. "I have to say," Tom observed, looking around the cozy cabin, "this is exactly what I hoped would happen when I watched you three together on that coach. You've built something special here." Jake and Margaret exchanged a glance, both suddenly aware of the assumption Tom was making about their relationship. Neither corrected him, but Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Margaret has been invaluable," Jake said carefully. "I don't know what Rose and I would have done without her. And Rose has given me a reason to embrace life again," Margaret added. "She's brought joy back into my world when I thought I'd lost it forever." Tom nodded approvingly. "That little girl is lucky to have two people who love her so much. And you're both lucky to have found each other." After Tom left the next morning, continuing on his route to Denver, Jake and Margaret found themselves dealing with an awkwardness that hadn't existed before his visit. Tom's words had brought their unspoken feelings closer to the surface, making it impossible to ignore the question of what they really meant to each other. That evening, after Rose had been put to bed, they sat by the fire in unusual silence. Finally, Margaret spoke. "Jake, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be completely honest with me." "Of course," Jake replied, though his heart was beating faster with nervousness. "When you offered me this position, was it really just about needing help with Rose? Or were you hoping for something more?" Jake considered his words carefully. "At the time, it truly was just about Rose. You were so good with her, and she needed what you could offer. But I'd be lying if I said my feelings hadn't changed over these months." "Changed how?" Jake stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the star-filled sky. "I've come to care about you, Margaret. Not just as Rose's caregiver or as someone who keeps my house, but as a woman I respect and admire. I find myself thinking about you even when you're not around, wondering what you're thinking about, wanting to share things with you that have nothing to do with Rose or the ranch. Margaret was quiet for so long that Jake began to worry he had said too much, that he had ruined the comfortable relationship they had built. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was afraid you might say that." Jake turned to face her, his heart sinking. "I'm sorry if I've made you uncomfortable." "I never meant—" "No, you don't understand," Margaret interrupted, rising from her chair to meet his eyes. "I'm afraid because I've been having the same feelings, and I don't know if it's right. We both loved other people so deeply, and sometimes I feel like caring about you is a betrayal of Thomas and his father, even though they're both gone." Jake crossed the room to stand in front of her, close enough to see the uncertainty in her eyes. "Sarah told me something before she died. She said she didn't want me to spend my life mourning her, that she wanted Rose to grow up in a house full of love and laughter, not sadness and regret. I think she would approve of what we've built here. And, Thomas." Margaret's voice caught slightly. "Thomas would want his mother to be happy. I know that. But, knowing it and feeling it are different things. We don't have to decide anything tonight," Jake said gently. "We don't have to change anything that's working well. But, I wanted you to know how I felt, because Tom made me realize that what we have is already special, regardless of what we call it." Margaret nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. "I love her, Jake. I love Rose as if she were my own daughter. And, I love the life we've created here together. If those feelings could grow into something more, if we could become a real family instead of just people helping each other survive, I think I'd like that very much." Jake reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. When she didn't, he gently cupped her face in his hands, brushing away a tear with his thumb. "We have all the time in the world to figure this out," he said softly. "Rose needs us both, and maybe that's enough for now. Maybe the love will come naturally, when we're ready for it." Margaret smiled through her tears, leaning into his touch. "Maybe it already has." As they stood there in the firelight, with their sleeping daughter safe in her cradle nearby, Jake felt the last pieces of his broken heart begin to heal. The stagecoach ride that had brought them together had been just the beginning of their journey. Now they were writing a new story together, one of second chances, unexpected families, and the quiet courage it takes to love again after loss. Outside, snow began to fall gently on the Morrison ranch, blanketing their small corner of the world in pristine white. Inside, three people who had found each other in their darkest moments were building something beautiful from the ashes of their grief. It wasn't the life any of them had planned, but it was the life they had chosen together, and it was more than enough.